Welcome to the CS Time Clock Web Interface Training, Session 4, Employee Hours. In the last CS Time Clock training session, we introduced schedules into the system. Schedules allocated to each employee are a way of telling the system what the anticipated start time, finish time, and any other parameters like lunch breaks and overtime categories. Once you have all your employees in the system and they are allocated schedules, you can start them clocking in parallel with your existing system if you have one. And after a suitable period, say one full payroll period, you can evaluate the employee clockings and see how closely they match your anticipated hours. There's a few ways we can do this. We can look at payroll hours as to get a broad overview of what employees have worked for a payroll period, and we do that under the Browse menu. So we go to Browse, Payroll Hours. A date range has to go in there, which is your payroll period. In this case, it's the 1st of the 5th to the 7th of the 5th. If you change that, you press Apply. And here we see a summary of all the hours. Now, the payroll person is generally going to know whether this makes any sense or not. They would know for Jim, for argument's sake, that he works 40 hours normal hours. That makes sense. And somebody has probably approved in the system some overtime. Peter, by comparison, only works 3 10-hour days, and that would be what would be anticipated for Peter. Jimmy's son here, you would expect him to work 37.5 hours of normal time and some overtime. But if we look down further, we see Julie, who works 37.5 hours, but only has 22.5. In closer inspection, if you look along that same line, you'll see the category at the end here, which is sick leave. There's 2 days of sick leave in there. Just to recap on those categories again, we've got the date category, employee, surname, first name, and the 4 different time categories, extra, normal, overtime, and overtime 2, plus Saturdays, Sundays, and holiday, sick, and paid leave. The variance is really just the amount of hours above or below what's expected for the normal hours for that employee. We'll talk about that in greater detail later on. So if we look further again, we see that Will has only 30 hours of normal time when we expect Will to have 37. So this is a case where you may go to the daily hours for that employee. Best way to do that is to go to the Browse Employee screen. And looking at Will's records, second from the left, is the employee hours. So we click on that and it'll show the hours for Will in this given date range. And what we've noticed here is he's forgotten to clock out on that Monday. So he started at 9, but he's forgotten to clock out. So in this case, somebody would have to verify Will's finish time, and it can be addressed in a couple of different ways. You can add a clocking in by going back to the employee and down to Will's clockings here, and you can add that clocking in just by pressing the Insert button, selecting the right date, selecting the right time for the clocking, selecting the right person, and then making the clock in the correct direction. This was an out clocking at whatever time, and then press Add. But I think in this instance, the better way to do it, if we go back to Employees and back to Will's hours in this second icon here called Employee Hours, what you can do is you can just override this using the Edit icon at the end of the screen. Just press Change, tick the Reprocess box, and what we can do is just click the normal category. We want to override 0 with 7.5 hours. And then we put forgot to clock in here and save. And now you'll see that this icon is changed to an O for an override record. And even though there isn't any clockings in there, it's still 7.5 hours. Now there's another interesting one here to look at for Will. On Tuesday, he's got quite a lot of time in the extra column. And in this instance, it may just be that he's clocked on early, but a supervisor might know that he asked him to start early on that day. You can deal with that in another way as well. You could go and change his schedule for that particular day, but that's not such a good idea. It's a bit cumbersome, and you'd have to change it back for the following week. So what we do instead is we do another override. We click on the Edit pencil, we reprocess, and the extra hour, we want to override to be 0. We leave the normal the same. We'll leave the overtime the same in this instance, but he now has 2 hours in the overtime 2 category. That one plus this one. So we're going to make that 2 instead. And we're putting started early in there and we're saving it. And now it's another override, and overrides are instant where the correct times are in there. When we move back to the payroll hours for employees, we'll see that all of Will's hours are now in there for that complete week. He's up to 37 hours, 11.5 hours overtime, 3 hours of overtime too, 3 hours of Saturday, 3 hours of Sunday. And we can discuss how to do clever things like move those Saturday and Sundays into the overtime categories in the advanced configuration section in the next video. So just to recap, the employee's hours is your starting place to see whether the hours have been calculated correctly and there isn't something you need to do. And you're looking for normal hours to be correct. Anna's are very low, but Anna only works 3 days a week, so that's what we would expect from her. Sometimes she works some overtime. Somebody would have approved that. We saw Julie's was 22.5. We know it should be 37. That's because she's got that's because she has 2 days in sick leave. So now might be a good time to talk about how sick leave gets added into the system. You can do sick leave in a few different ways through the individual daily records. So if we know that an employee is short some hours and we want to add some leave in, then you can pick the employee and you can add leave in directly from the Browse Employees screen through the leave icon. I'll do it with this employee here. And the way to do that is to simply just double click on the date. In the system, we need to reprocess it because we're adding it after the fact. It's approved by default in the system, although we can have an approval that must come from a supervisor. That would be covered in the advanced features. Employee selected, the date of the leave type. In this case, we're going to make it sick leave. The percentage of a day, if it was half a day, in her case, it would be 4 hours. So we'd make it 50% of a day, and a reason if a reason is required. And then when you add that, it appears in the calendar according to the color of the leave type that's selected, and it would also appear in the payroll hours calculation in that week, October 2023. We can add, modify leave types in the system. Under the processing menu, we've got leave types. We click on leave types and we can add or remove leave types in here or change leave types. This will be discussed in a later session. In the next session, we'll talk about even more advanced settings for the CS time clock.